Good morning.
Good morning.
Things look a lot different in my life today, but when I was 14, I was one of those hell-raising kind of kids. I came from a hell-raising kind of family with a bad reputation in a small town. And the town had a very low employment rate, and there were lots of drugs and things that were easy to find. Needless to say, I got in trouble a lot, especially after addiction got a hold of me. One summer, I ended up sitting in jail for breaking into a building with 4 other kids. And they wanted to make an example out of us, for good reason, obviously. And so at my sentencing, they told each of us that we were all going to be 100% responsible for all of the damages. And this meant not only that if we didn't pay our part that we would go to jail, but if someone else didn't pay their part, we would all be held responsible for it. And that all had to be paid by the time the last of us turned 21. And so, didn't think much of that after the time. I kind of lived my life in a haze. But about 10 years later, at 24, my life looks a lot different. I'm a Christian, I'm clean and sober. I had some friends who lived in this shady apartment complex, and I went to visit them. And I was leaving the apartment complex literally to go home and prepare for tomorrow's Sunday school lesson. Things are a little different. But when I was pulling out of the apartment complex, there's a sidewalk. It was like 11 o'clock at night, and I could see that no one was coming, so you're supposed to technically stop at the sidewalk, then stop at the street, then go out. Well, I didn't do that. And the cop was looking for somebody to pull over, and anybody from that apartment complex seemed to be fair game. So he pulls me over, and I'm sitting on the side of the road, and we're talking about, giving my license and everything like that. Well, guess what? Somebody didn't pay their part of that fine from 10 years earlier. So I'm sitting there, and the cops asked me if I'm from Washington State. I'm like, yeah, I was born there. What's the deal? Well, it comes to find out that there's been a warrant for my arrest in Washington State for a couple of years. A couple of years I haven't really been in trouble. And so I find myself off to county jail, surprisingly. And I thought this is going to be like one of those hidden camera shows. Somebody's going to pop out from behind a tree and tell me that the joke is on me. But there was no joke. So I went to jail that night. Actually have a card that has my little inmate picture on there. If anybody wants to see that later. So since I was being extradited to Washington State from Oregon, they didn't put me in the general population. They put me in solitary confinement, which means that you get out of your cell for 2 half-hour breaks a day. And needless to say, I was pretty mad about this whole thing. I felt like I was being persecuted. And I did get the chance to share my faith with some people in jail, and write some scripture on the wall and things like that. But I'd love to tell you that God brought me to jail that day, and all these people were won to Christ and everything like that. But that isn't what happened. The few conversations that I did have with anybody went downhill pretty fast. It seemed like the people in jail all they wanted to talk about was the ways that they were going to be going to jail next. And so it wasn't the most fruitful conversation. And so I kept looking around for that reason. It seemed that God wanted me to come to jail. And all I could come back to was my own stupidity, my own deluded teenage angst and just this mistake that I had made. And all I found time for was prayer and push-ups and frustration. And so it looked like I was going to spend a lot of time there too, because when they extradite you, they just kind of move you from one county to the next county at their convenience. It's not exactly a high priority, so I was going to be probably a month on my way back to go to the county seat where I originally got in trouble for that crime. And luckily my stepdad, he was sick of me not showing up to work and completely mystified that I was in jail. So he called ahead to the county seat where I was at and asked them how it was possible that I could violate my probation that ended like 10 years earlier. And so they did some digging. It turns out that a couple of the other people who had been a part of the original crime had already gotten arrested and had already paid the whole fine off. So there wasn't even any money for me to pay, and eventually they let me out. You know, and my experience with jail, after being a person who had changed, you know, was interesting. It made me think about life differently, how far God had brought me. And I think sometimes that we think in terms of happiness and joy, and we get those things confused with one another. Happiness is something that's bound to our circumstances, but joy is something different. It's a gift from God. It's a fruit of the Spirit. It's not something that people can take away from you. And so Paul here in his letter, he's in jail, most likely in Caesarea, and he's filled with this joy that even his most horrible circumstances can't take away from him. And prison, Paul's day would make my solitary confinement with a half-inch mattress and a stainless steel toilet and the worst cafeteria food that you could possibly imagine seem like a stay at a nice hotel. I mean, he was most likely shackled to the floor with a bucket for a bathroom. That's kind of what you're dealing with. And the only food he would receive is the food that his friends would send to him. Otherwise, he might starve to death in there. But Paul somehow had, in his trip to jail, he somehow had joy that was with him. And you can tell from the letter of Philippians that underneath it all is this big thread of joy. And this is pretty impressive to me as a guy who spent 4 days in solitary confinement, really frustrated and angry at God. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that when I was in jail that I could have written a letter like that he wrote to Philippians. But maybe today after I've walked with the Lord for a while, maybe that joy wouldn't be completely crushed in me. I believe that as Christians we can have that kind of joyful experience, that when we have that relationship with God, we can have profound trust in God, profound meaning and depth that transcends even the darkest of circumstances. And the joy of this letter comes through also in the fact that Paul doesn't seem to be writing a broken church. He's actually writing to like his star pupil of the churches that he planted. It's encouraging them on the way. Most of Paul's letters were to struggling churches, but this was not the case. And so this is probably Paul's favorite church that he planted, a church that had given to him even out of their poverty to help him out of jams before, and probably the church that was going to help provide the food for him while he stayed in prison. And so this was also likely like a thank you letter from Paul. And so while Philippians teaches us profound things about God, it kind of does that incidentally. This is perhaps Paul's most personal letter that he has written. These are written to dear friends, to people that Paul loved. And often, as is the case with love, it pushes us to pray for people. It pushes us in the direction of interceding to those that we love. Richard Foster writes, "If we truly love people, we will desire for them far more than it is in our power to give them. And this will lead us to prayer." And I think love can be a heartbreaking thing. It can be a powerful thing that pushes us past our own selfishness and self-centeredness and into a relationship with another that defines us. It's not something that we just give to someone else. It's something that changes us. You know, if you don't think that being in a relationship with a person changes you, you should borrow my daughter for the day. I guarantee you that you'll go on adventures you never thought because of that relationship that you have. And so Paul gives us a picture of love that we don't often see in the world. So often our definition of love focuses on the emotional, powerful emotional side of love. In his prayer he asks that love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight. I think this points us to the side of love that pushes us to the goal of being like fully human in the best sense of that word. It's a love that puts us on the path of discovering deeply who we are and who we are in relationship with God and others. The side of love that helps us to seek after things like wisdom. There's a mystic from the 10th century named Bernard of Clairvaux, and there's a quote from him that's been profoundly meaningful to me as I have been on this journey of pastoral ministry and theological education in general, and I just want to read this quote from him. "There are those who seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That is curiosity. There are those who seek knowledge to be known by others. That is vanity. There are those who seek knowledge in order to serve. That is love. And I think Paul's prayer talks about that kind of love, that kind of growing knowledge of love, that growing of knowledge of depth and insight, and allowing the kind of depth and insight that allows the church to discern what is good and what is best. And that's a dangerous prayer to pray for the church, a dangerous prayer for us to pray. For love to abound in us means that we would make ourselves less. It means getting out of the way of the greater good, out of the will of God. It means pulling ourselves back to empower others, helping them to develop fully into who they are, rather than controlling things for our own benefit and comfort and ease. The call for love to abound is the harder way, not the easier, softer way. It's the little way, the way of making yourself small so that others can grow. You know, when I went to jail before, the first time, I was in a place in my life where I could tell the good from the bad, but I didn't always choose very well. When I went to jail the second time, my life was a lot different. The problems I had seemed to be more telling the difference between the good and the best. It's a struggle that we have after walking with the Lord for a while. And for Paul, this was a problem that had to do with blamelessness, you know, a problem. And choosing between two good things seems like such a small problem to have. But this is a problem that comes from blamelessness. And what does that mean, I think? Thinking when we're truly free to live our lives before God and fully desire His will in our lives, that we face that kind of choice a lot more often, the choice between the good and the best. We're not stuck on that good and bad kind of continuum anymore. We're past that, and God begins to trust us with deeper levels of discernment, bigger choices that mean so much more than just negative consequences or positive consequences. And further, he goes on to say, what does it mean to be filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes from Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God? I think Paul is pointing us to something that looks a lot like a sustained amount of work. Lots of people look at this verse and say, well, it's God that's working in you, so how does that work? But here, Paul recognizes that it's God that works in us, but fruits aren't things that happen by accident. They're not things that happen from shortcuts and things like that. It's something that comes from a long, sustained faithfulness. Faithfulness is a process that we embark on with God. It's something that God does in us, but it's something that we will allow God to do in us as well. It's not something that you just arrive at one day, this place of fruitfulness and abounding, and then you're just done. It's something that continues, that God continues to work in you. But we do get to see some of the fruits along the way from being in that relationship with God and letting Him have His way in us. So to be filled with fruits is not just this kind of flash-in-the-pan spiritual experience that many people seek after. It's the long-term benefits of walking with the Lord, being shaped by the Lord, and experiencing that transformation that's a part of the Christian life. Jen preached a while back about the superficiality of the church, and I think perhaps the greatest adversary to this kind of deep knowledge that Paul talks about, this deep knowledge of God's work in us and deep knowledge of one another based on our love for each other, is our own superficiality. Any pastor or leader of the church would pray this kind of prayer that Paul prays. Praying for the desire for God to work and shape the church and the growth and depth of knowledge and love and the fruits of righteousness. Any pastor would pray for that. Anyone who cares deeply about the church would pray for that. But will we pray this kind of prayer for ourselves? I think that's the real point here. For our church, will we seek these things out? Or will we settle for something less? I think that's a choice we each have to make in our own heart and in our life. And so Paul acknowledges here that God is the one that both began and will finish this work in our lives. He entrusts that God will take care of this Philippian church just like a farmer entrusts his crops to God. A farmer can only do the work of preparing the way. He can till the ground, he can plant the seed, he can water the seed, but then he has to just trust that God will carry that through to the end of the process. All he can do is make the conditions right. But after the seeds are planted and watered, it's God that causes the plants to grow. It's God that causes the church to grow. And not just numerically, but spiritually, growing to maturity. I think God doing this work is no excuse for us to not think about our part, about how we let God work in our lives. Do we long to see that love grow deeper within us? Do we desire a deeper knowledge of our church, the people in our lives that God has placed and called us together? Do we long to see the fruits of righteousness at work fully blossoming in our lives? And Paul is writing to his star pupil in a sense. This is the best church that he planted, probably. The church with the least amount of problems. A church that seems ready to wake up to the finer points of the Christian life. But no star pupil is that star pupil by accident. It takes dedication and work and trust that God will carry this work through us into completion. And mostly I think it takes love breaking free of the chains that bind it and roaming around the church. In the Dr. Seuss book, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, one of my favorite children's books, the Grinch is described as someone whose heart is 2 sizes too small. Could we be a church that prays with Paul that our heart would be 2 sizes too big? That we might become a church whose heart enlarges to its fullest capacity, even beyond what we could imagine. And that we would seek that joy and glory to the praise of God. What would that look like here among us? As we go into our time of open worship, I just want you to wrestle with that question. What's holding back the love? What's holding back that knowledge of ourselves? Sometimes that knowledge is just the fact that we don't spend any time together. But we only see each other sometimes on Sunday morning. But how can we go deeper? How can we be a church that abounds in love and knowledge of each other? So as we go into this time of open worship, listen to God's Spirit and do as God directs. If you feel called to speak, stand and the microphone will be brought to you. Thank you.